All right, my name is Adam Driscoll, and today I'm going to be talking about PSBlazor. It's a new web technology for PowerShell that is built into PowerShell Universal v5, which will be releasing later this year. Just thanks to our sponsor here for getting this organized, and wouldn't be here without them. My name is Adam Driscoll. If you weren't here for my last talk, I am the owner and lead dev at ironmansoftware.com, or Ironman Software LLC, and I'm a PowerShell MVP. I've been an MVP for about 10 years. I'm an author, blogger, YouTuber, mostly about tech and PowerShell stuff, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm extremely jet-lagged. PowerShell Universal is a platform for building web-based tools with PowerShell. Some of the core features are APIs such as REST APIs and WebSocket APIs, automation features such as scheduling, script execution that integrates really tightly with PowerShell, so you can do things like entering parameters and getting input or output back about PowerShell objects and that kind of thing. We also have UI frameworks, which we're going to be talking about today. In my last talk, I talked about kind of what we're going to be referring to as our PowerShell apps, where you define your API using PowerShell scripts, custom commandlets, and it produces interactive UIs, which are pretty customizable because you are just writing PowerShell. But what we're going to be talking about today is kind of a new UI framework we're looking at. It's built on some technology that's come out of Microsoft and ASP.NET Core. I think it started in 5 or 6, and it's really evolved in the last couple versions to the point that we wanted to leverage it inside PowerShell Universal since we use that stack for the platform. PowerShell Universal has a bunch of security features, such as authentication and authorization to systems like Azure Active Directory or Entra ID, on-prem Azure, Active Directory via Windows authentication and WS federated services and that kind of thing. PowerShell Universal has a bunch of built-in development features for PowerShell, including IntelliSense and syntax highlighting, code formatting via PS Script Analyzer, and even debugging directly in the platform. We also have a PowerShell extension you can use to use your local editing VS Code instance to update the PowerShell scripts inside PowerShell Universal. And as kind of mentioned through all of this, it's very PowerShell focused. We've kind of built a platform around running PowerShell scripts and making sure that you have the best experience for PowerShell in it. So what we're talking about today is kind of based on a technology that's come out of Microsoft called Blazor. So if you haven't heard of Blazor, Blazor is a new kind of UI framework that they've built into ASP.NET Core to allow you to build UIs both kind of what they call client-side and server-side using C# and other like .NET languages. So rather than having to necessarily write all the JavaScript in between a ASP.NET Core HTTP REST API and something like a React web app, you can actually write C# code that interacts directly with the HTML browser, generates that HTML CSS without having to necessarily write a whole bunch of that yourself. So you can execute JavaScript, but JavaScript is optional. Kind of where we are with PowerShell Universal is it's a lot of JavaScript and a lot of HTML that we've built by hand, and we're looking at Blazor as a way to kind of simplify our development efforts and also leverage a lot of technology that's coming out of Microsoft and a lot of the ecosystem that's growing around Blazor. So some things to note about Blazor is it actually supports what WebAssembly, which is WASM, and server-side implementations. WebAssembly being that it actually will download that DLL and run it directly in your browser. So rather than running a bunch of JavaScript and going back and forth between the JavaScript framework and some REST API and stuff, the WASM assembly is actually downloaded and run directly in the browser, which has lots of implications. You get kind of like right now it's like it takes a while to download and start up, but once it's downloaded, it's really fast because it doesn't have to make web requests necessarily, only for data, not for all the client-side JavaScript and that kind of thing. It's just all there in that DLL. The server-side implementation is very similar to the way that PowerShell Universal works now with PowerShell apps, where we have a JavaScript library that we have developed, and it communicates back and forth to the PowerShell Universal server over an ASP.NET Core WebSocket. So anytime you're clicking a button or loading something, it's communicating back and forth to that server. So what's cool about Blazor is that you can, depending what you're doing, you can kind of switch between WASM and server-side implementations. And they also have a hybrid approach where certain things will be downloaded into your browser and certain things will remain on the server depending on what supports it. So that's pretty much what's cool about Blazor. It's kind of on the bleeding edge of web technology. WASM is still, I think, not totally adopted yet, but you're starting to see it in things like kind of what they call progressive web apps, where an application can not only run in your browser on a server, but it could also be downloaded and run locally as a client application. So that's where WASM really shines, I think. Yeah, and aside from the fact that you can write everything in C#, which is great for us when we're building a lot of stuff based on C# for PowerShell Universal. So in regard to that, what is PSBlazor? It's a web technology built in the PowerShell Universal, and it's built on top Blazor. So we're actually using the Blazor engine to effectively generate Blazor markup and parse XML very similar to Blazor into UIs that then integrate with PowerShell. So they integrate with PowerShell via function and variable binding, kind of unlike our PowerShell apps, which I showed in the last talk. These render more based on the XML syntax of that Blazor technology, which makes it faster to render the application. And PowerShell is only called when necessary, such as like certain user interactions or that kind of thing. So right now, PSBlazor does not have WASM support, primarily because PowerShell is not supported in WASM. There are some projects that are out there to get PowerShell running in WASM, but I would say there's limited benefit because typically what you want to do in the PowerShell engine is execute things against other services, and to get WASM support for every module, you'd have to get every module to support WASM as well, so it becomes more limited in terms of what you would actually use WASM and PowerShell for. So a little note about PowerShell versus Blazor apps inside PowerShell Universal. Blazor apps or PSBlazor apps reduce the resilience of PowerShell for everything. So right now, when you load a page inside a PowerShell app inside PowerShell Universal, it's got to execute at least one PowerShell script to render that page. And depending on what you're calling, if you're using dynamics and that kind of thing, all of a sudden you could be running dozens of PowerShell scripts just to render that page. This reduces that and has a static structured layout via an XML type syntax that is very similar to the Blazor one. We actually just modeled it right after that to render that, which effectively avoids having to call so much PowerShell because we're just rendering XML, which is good for performance and that kind of thing. It is more rigid, so we don't have quite the ability to do loops, and you have variables and if statements and all this kind of stuff inside your PowerShell script, so that might feel a little unfamiliar. But we are using like binding, and we do have some things in the works for conditionals and dynamic generation of this XML, so it is still pretty dynamic. It's just that we want it to be a little more structured so that we can build better tooling over the top. Because if you've ever built a PowerShell app in PowerShell Universal, it's very hands-on. You have to really write a lot of code. We have a very basic designer that has been difficult to develop because PowerShell is just not as structured as something like XML. So this way, we are separating out the PowerShell from the XML so we can provide some better visual tooling for generating that XML, and then you can write your PowerShell script without having to worry as much about the UI in your PowerShell script. And then, like I said, they have a similar architecture, though, in the end. I'll talk a little bit about how we're executing these things for PowerShell apps and Blazor apps, but it's effectively the same thing. We're opening a run space, we're running your PowerShell script, and it's doing something in your UI. So, all right, so after all that, let's just look at some demos. So I don't actually have a conditions demo, but other than that, we're gonna look at some of these other ones. Okay, so I'm gonna bring these up. And if I could get my browser to open, and I've been told that this shouldn't be in dark mode. It's hard to read. Switch, and then hopefully this works in non-dark mode. Yes, okay. All right, so this is actually, just like a note, this is our beta version that we're working on right now. It's gonna be coming out later this month, well, later next month. And as you can see now, instead of, we had like a, oh, yep, sorry. How's that? Okay. Previously, you would have like a user interface section, but now we have apps, and we have our PowerShell apps, which are just the same apps that you've been using, but we've replaced what we used to call pages with Blazor apps. And these Blazor apps are going to use our PSBlazor technology to allow you to create interfaces. And what's kind of cool is this whole admin console, like if you saw my last session, it looks very similar, but we actually built the whole admin console in PSBlazor. It's using the same, or not PSBlazor, just Blazor. It's using the same UI framework, which is called Ant Design, and they've actually ported their Ant Design library to a Blazor component, so we were able to really easily kind of port it over to Blazor itself. So there's some hiccups we're working through, but we're really happy with how this turned out. All right, so when we go look at a Blazor app, there's not much going on here. You can see it just says, welcome to PSBlazor. There are some cool technical differences here that actually make it much easier for us to not only develop this, but also kind of rev on features and add things much more easily than we could with PowerShell apps. The biggest thing is that this uses the same technology as the admin console now. So it's not opening a different JavaScript web app that we had to create by hand and communicate with all this custom built WebSocket control code and that kind of thing. It's all just built into Blazor using the same library. And what you'll notice is that we have this little code button here, and what that's going to do is just pop up this little code editor at the bottom. And we've now broken apps into two different distinct code files. The one being a Razor code file, so that's kind of the syntax that Microsoft is calling their Razor pages and Blazor pages and components. And as you can see, it's just XML. And it's very similar to how HTML would look, except these are custom components. So rather than having divs and inputs and stuff like that, you have an alert, just like you would have a new UD alert in a PowerShell app. And we're actually using all the same components in Ant Design and kind of layering on some helpers to make it easier to work in PSBlazor and integrate with PowerShell. So in this example, this page that I just created doesn't run any PowerShell script. The PowerShell tab here is empty, and it just loaded that based on this Razor definition here. But I'm going to step through some examples of this, and we're just going to get started with some basics. So I'm just going to grab this, put it in here. So as you can see, we've added a couple more components. We've got a row, so they have rows and columns and all this stuff. We're going to be building out interactive documentation, similar to what we have in PowerShell apps, where you'll be able to see lots of examples of all the components and actually play with them in real time to see how they work. And it'll list all the attributes. And what's awesome about this is it's all .NET code. So rather than having this arbitrary JavaScript library that is not integrated with PowerShell Universal at all, we can interrogate these libraries and see all the parameters and stuff like that this Blazor library offers. And then because of that, we can do things like provide IntelliSense directly inside this code editor, even though it's a Razor thing and not PowerShell IntelliSense. It's kind of the same concept where we're just looking up the parameters for this alert, and then you can see that there's a bunch of things that we can add. So in this example, I just added another alert, and I added a button. So I save it, it updates and re-renders this PSBlazor page, and now I have a button that I can click that isn't going to do anything because it's not hooked up. So the way that we kind of integrate with PowerShell is kind of two-way binding, I would call it. So on an on-click, for example, any event that's happening inside PSBlazor calls back to a PowerShell function. In this example, I'm binding a button on-click to a click me function, which then exists in PowerShell, but it does not yet. So grab that, and let's plop that in here. You can see this is just a standard PowerShell function. There are some what we call services available to PSBlazor apps, like a message service that'll show messages. We've got a notification service, a modal service, that kind of thing, to like pop things up and do other things inside your PSBlazor app. And you can call standard PowerShell script like start process. So I save this, and now I click this. You can see it worked. It was kind of quick, but then you saw Notepad pop up, and I got a message, and I got Notepad displayed. So it's a little more straightforward, I'd say, to develop apps in this way, because you're kind of differentiating between the look and feel of your app in the Razor page and the actual functionality of your app in the PowerShell script. And it kind of brings the PowerShell script more back to just a PowerShell script, rather than a PowerShell script filled with a lot of custom commandlets and stuff like that that we have to implement by hand to generate the UI. So that's where it's I think a little bit easier to kind of wrap your head around. All right, so that's kind of the basics of creating a Blazor app. And I want to talk a little bit about variables, because this is how you start to get interactivity into your Blazor app. So I'm just going to generate this, and then we'll step through it. All right, so we're currently on the fence, but we're avoiding custom variable scopes. We talked a little bit about custom variable scopes in the previous talk, but we're just using hash tables right now, or I think it's a dictionary or something, to set variables inside PowerShell Universal. It just works a little bit better. And the idea being is that this is a PSM1 file, so it's just a module that's loaded, and you can do things outside the module scope, but they're only going to be executed once when the page is loaded. So when the user loads the page, this is executed, the module is loaded, the variable is set to the default value. And then, let's see, I think our binding isn't working. But a couple things to note here. So we were setting this variable just to hello world. And if we actually go look at the Razor content here, you'll notice that I am doing an alert here that says message equals $my_variable. And what that's doing is it's getting that PowerShell variable, putting it into the Blazor builder that we have here, and then you'll notice that the UI is updating. So we have hello world here. That actually came from that PowerShell script. Now, if we look at something like this button click, what is my variable? Reverse, you can actually access those variables within your functions. So what is my variable will be called, and then it'll display a success with the value of that variable. So you get like hello world. That, again, came out of the PowerShell code setting that variable. And then finally, you can do things like update variables, where I'm just setting this variable into this dictionary, updates it. We're going to do a toast, and then the UI should reflect that right away. So I clicked update variable, hello world updated. I didn't have to find the component to update. It just automatically binds to that variable and updates the UI based on that. I think my final example is not working because this isn't the right thing. Actually, you know what? All right, we're going to try debugging live. Do you think it's case sensitive? Nope. Oh, no. Now it's dark again. I'll just go back here and turn it back to light. Still work in progress. I don't know why it's dark again. Oh, I know what I probably need to do. All right. Okay, So yeah, that's kind of how variables work. One thing that just doesn't seem to be working right now is also the ability to bind variables. So one big problem with PowerShell Universal and PowerShell apps, the way they are right now, is if you were to update a component, for example, this input component, and you would type into it, the only way to like get that value of that component is actually to run a PowerShell script. It doesn't actually send anything back to the server unless you're requesting it. The way PSBlazor works is it actually uses a WebSocket, and they have like binary encoding on that WebSocket, and it sends those values back and forth to the web server and updates that automatically. What's cool about this is there's no PowerShell involved. It just updates that variable in the background when it works, and then you can use those values in your PowerShell functions as they're updated, rather than having to do any kind of like wiring yourself. It just does that automatic binding. So again, that's another like big performance improvement for PSBlazor apps, and that's why we're kind of looking at this as a way to like potentially scale apps a little bit further than you would with a PowerShell app. All right, so yep. Yep.
I'm not a bit confused. Where was this PowerShell running, and how was it able to stop Notepad on your computer?
It's running locally. I just have this as a console app running.
In the browser?
No. Like I had, this is like my IDE. This is Writer.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's just running on my desktop. It's in my environment. Yeah, exactly. I was just trying to show an example. Yeah, right. Yeah. So this is all running locally, just on this host. You wouldn't be able to do that in a server environment. Yeah. Not yet until they get PowerShell running in WASM.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a little example of, we're just gonna look at an event callback. This is another kind of simple thing, but I just wanna kind of highlight some cool functionality. This is something we kind of get for free from using the Blazor framework. Is Blazor also offers like a bunch of information in the event handlers. So not only can you get things like your variables, I'll talk a little bit about context variables in a second, but you can also get event args. Like this might be familiar to you if you've ever built a Windows form app or even like a WPF app. You typically get event args back from events inside of those, and you can like look up stuff. And in this case, what I'm actually doing is I've got this click me. We're automatically binding in that event arg, and then that event arg is actually generated by PSBlazor or Blazor itself, and we're sending it into the PowerShell script. And you'll see, I'll show you in a sec with the log what this actually generates. But if I save this and I click it, you'll see I got 70 on there, and that's the actual like position of my mouse. So if I like move my mouse around, you'll see that it's changing because it's actually picking up that position. Like Blazor's automatically doing all that for us, so you can kind of do pretty cool stuff. Like I don't even know what you would use that for, but if we actually look at the log, you'll see that we've like hooked in write host, so you can like log out stuff, and I'm just writing out the events as a string, but these are all the properties you could access. You could access like, the screen offset, the client offset, and if it's movement, you have different control keys clicked and that kind of thing. So we're still wiring up the different event handler types. Right now we only have like forms and mouse events, but there are things for keyboard events and all that kind of stuff that eventually we'll have in there. All right, so let's look at a form. So this is how you generate a form in PSBlazor. There's just a form component. And the way that the UI library you're using integrates with this is that it actually uses input binding to kind of bind to a model. So your model in this case is going to be a PowerShell class. And we're just going to look at what that looks like. So I just have a very simple PowerShell class. This could have a bunch of properties on it, but I just have a single string property. And when my page loads, I'm creating a new model that I'm then going to bind to my form. And you'll see that here. And then I'm also going to add an input and bind to the individual property of that model. And then the idea being, when I click the submit button, it's going to issue the onFinish function, which in my case is my PowerShell submit function. And as we saw with the mouse events, we're going to get event args back, and the form is actually going to provide us with the model data from that, that form. So I'm going to save this, but let's just check. So now if I do hello, and you can see that it pops up the message. Obviously, this could go off. It could start a PowerShell script in PowerShell Universal. It could, run some PowerShell code somewhere. But the idea being, again, we've kind of separated out the look and feel from the actual execution via PowerShell and Razor. There's a lot we can do with forms, obviously, in terms of validation and different input types and that kind of thing. A lot of this stuff is just kind of auto-generated right now. So a lot of the things we're binding one-to-one with the Ant Design library and just exposing here, like the input component, their form item component. Like, we've done nothing except bind the Ant Design to something that we're showing in the UI here and generating. So that allows us to move a lot faster, and it also avoids bugs in the future because we're just not changing anything. Another really important thing that we find users doing is creating tables. So we want to make sure that's really good. I don't have the PowerShell hooked up yet, so that's why we're seeing an error. But the idea here is that I'm actually defining a table, and the table has a data source. The data source is a variable that I am going to set in PowerShell. So that data source then will allow me to render those values inside columns inside my table. And from there, we can actually do things like do custom rendering of property columns, and we could add action columns to add actions to the rows in the column. So if we grab the PowerShell so it stops complaining. Oh no, I have a bad feeling that I have to refresh this page again. Yeah, okay. Well, it seems like we need a switch for this. All right. Oh. 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 All right, sorry. Oh, I copied the wrong one. All right. It's a beta. All right, there we go. So what I did in the code here is that I set a variable for services, and I just called getService, and literally just stored all the services in that getService variable. That's all I would really need to do to display this table. And then I've added a couple of property columns. I added these two property columns with name and status, and the name is just outputting the name, as you can see here. And then the status, I'm using an alert, and I'm using the context.status. So context is just the current thing. So this would be the row in the column. Depending on which component you're using, that context could be different. But in this case, it's a row in the table, and obviously this will all be well documented and that kind of thing. And we hope to, if we can, provide IntelliSense and stuff like that here. But it's actually grabbing that context value status, and that's where we're starting to see like stopped and running for each one of the services inside this custom alert that was just defined. And then finally, in the toggle button, which is in my action column, so that's just a button or toggle state. It's just a button that binds to this on-click toggle state, which created that button in each one of the rows. I'm actually accepting a context variable there as well. So that will actually receive that current row, and when I click on that button, you're going to get the name of the service. So I didn't have to do anything weird to go like grab which row I'm in or anything like that. It's just passed in automatically and then calls back to the PowerShell script with the correct context. So the one last thing I kind of want to talk about is like, okay, this is all pretty cool, but you can see where the limitations start to lie, where you start getting more complex things that you want to like generate based on PowerShell state. If you have conditions and that kind of thing, it gets hard to generate something like this dynamically. And one way we're working around that is by adding a dynamic component. So I'm going to do this the other way around. Grab the dynamic function. So what the dynamic does, damn it. I mean, dang it. The dynamic does is allows you to just return arbitrary XML back from let's make it bigger. Return arbitrary XML back from the function here. Oh no, I made it too big. And as you can see here, I'm just returning like literally a string of XML from this dynamic function. And when I pass that into a dynamic component, you just give the function, and then it will call that dynamic and execute the function and return, obviously, this alert that executed some PowerShell to generate a custom PSBlazor component. What's cool about dynamics too is they're context aware. So if I were in like a table or something like that that had a context, I could have a context variable in here and then render something custom inside each one of the cells inside the table. Yeah, so obviously this is very early, as you can see by some of the stuff I've run into during this demo, but we think it's a cool way to go for kind of simplifying some of the UI creation inside PowerShell Universal. PowerShell apps are great, but sometimes the overhead of building that is a little too much, and the pages feature that we currently have just isn't useful enough. You can do certain things, but pretty much what I've heard from every customer is eventually they hit some limitation and they can't achieve what they want with pages, so then they have to go back and just generate an entire PowerShell app themselves. So this is kind of some middle ground where we hope to kind of bridge that gap. So finally, we're just some roadmap stuff for this. We are doing a beta 1 mid-March, like I said. GA, we are planning for mid-July. Some upcoming features that probably will come out through the beta releases are templates, components, and cascading properties. So templates will be the ability to have a template defined inside your Blazor app, and that will be a skeleton of your application. So that might have like, you know, your own header at the top with your company name and logo. And you don't want to define that in every one of your Blazor apps. So then you have a template where you can put certain aspects of your Blazor app into that template and only customize the things that need to be changed. Components will be the ability to create your own components with PSBlazor. So for example, you know, you could have your own custom like alert or something like that, where you can reuse that throughout your Blazor apps, and they'll be able to accept properties and things to customize them externally. And finally, cascading properties are the idea of you want state that goes across the entire app. So for example, the username, or you know, like the theme, for example, you kept seeing me fail to change the theme. If you had a property like that that went across your whole app and you didn't want to have to like necessarily try to put that in each one of your components, we want to implement that. One big thing that I didn't mention in here is that because PSBlazor is XML and the PowerShell is separated from the PSBlazor syntax, XML is really easy to parse and really easy to generate, and because of that, we're going to be building a designer over the top of this so that you still get the pages experience, but you have a lot more control over what happens within your page. So we're targeting we are targeting a conversion from pages to this technology, and using a very similar designer that we have in the pages feature, where it's actually drag and droppable, and you can set properties and select resources inside PowerShell Universal, and it will generate the PSBlazor syntax for you, and then you can write any additional PowerShell script you want in the PSM1 files. for your PSBlazor apps. That's it. So we have another 10 minutes, I guess, for questions, if anyone has any. Yeah.
So right now the form validation doesn't work, you said?
Right now it's not implemented now, yeah.
Is the idea that you could then link that from the DTO? Like if you decorate a class, then do you want to pull it from there, or would you have to then actually describe it in the XML and on the Blazor side?
You can do it both ways. You don't have to, you can decorate it, yeah.
You could decorate the
Yeah.
class and you would pull it in from there.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So the Ant Design library already supports that. So you can actually use the built-in .NET. I don't remember the namespace, but there's built-in .NET things like required and like, you know, required lengths and stuff. It's very similar to PowerShell validate set stuff and that kind of thing.
That's what I'm trying to get. So like if you use a class that you decorate, then you can put like a validate set or whatever, like allow none or whatever, and then you're checking that on the form rather than us having to then do it on the Blazor side.
Yep, exactly. Yep. And that's one of the reasons that we want to use classes for that, so that kind of enforce that instead of like having like, I don't know, we will probably allow you to return arbitrary data too if you kind of defined it without a model, but at the moment it seems like this is kind of the way that the Ant Design framework works the best. So we'll see. We might simplify it in the future, but I would say that's kind of where we're headed. All right. Well, thank you for your time, and if you have any questions afterwards, just let me know.